Hello, and welcome to this session on FTAs, pacts and economic diplomacy, the latest soft power grab. With me to talk about this incredibly exciting area for the region is our Kristy Sandino, who's Head of International Policy at the CBI, and Professor Henry Gao, who's Associate Professor of Law at Singapore Management University. Let me start by saying a few words about the pivot to Indo-Pacific. It's easy to think that the world will become more multilateral without Donald Trump. All of the hopes of the world were resting on the shoulders of Joe Biden when he was elected, because it was felt that this would create a return to the multilateralism that we'd all been so comfortable with up until 2016. We've been disappointed since Biden came to power, not just because he's not put trade at the front of an agenda, but also potentially because the competitive and strategic threat of China has still weighed very heavily in US politics. Biden was never realistically going to be any different, but what he hasn't done is end tariffs against China. He hasn't restored bilateral relations, and President Xi and President Biden are meeting at the moment. And while they've agreed to respect each other, they are trying to untangle the complexity of their relations at the moment. The US has started to build a more strategic approach to the region. It's calling it its pivot to Indo-Pacific. It's formed a strategic alliance with Japan, Australia, and India called the Quad, which sounds a bit like something that comes out of the 1960s and 1970s rockers. And the EU, alongside all of this, has launched its program, what's called Open Strategic Autonomy, alongside a pivot of a technological and also a trade and also a military security focus towards the Indo-Pacific region. So looking into the region from outside, there are a lot of issues that are making it more complicated geopolitically. Other issues are also there. President Biden has launched a supply chain review, which is particularly focused on a number of strategic supply chains, which are an attempt to try and limit human rights abuses across the region and to try and make supply chains more sustainable at a top line level. But truthfully, it's also about making sure that the power of China, particularly in semiconductors, is limited. So there are general tensions in the region. They're escalating China's military buildup, but it's more than that. It's about technology, and it's actually about the economic power of China as well. Now, against all of that backdrop, and trade is one of the things that's important, is the fact that this is an incredibly important region in trade terms. If you look at the whole of Asia Pacific, its internal trade, so just the trade it does with itself across the geography, is worth nearly $4 trillion. Its external trade with the rest of the world, exports, are $3.4 trillion. ASEAN, again, intra-regional trade, $320 billion. The Rcep region, $2.7 trillion. Cptpp, which comes into force in January, intra-regional trade, $322 billion, but its trade with the outside world, nearly $3 trillion. The whole region is worth around a third of the value of world trade. So it's colossally important what happens. And to some extent, it's that the US is worried about, the fact that this region is growing in importance. It's a strategic competition. It's fraught with difficulties. China asked to join the CPTPP, but that was seen as something in relation to a backlash against the AUKUS coalition. The AUKUS coalition, the alliance for nuclear-powered submarines between Australia, the UK, and the US, was seen as an escalation by China. But Japan and South Korea and other ASEAN countries regarded the military buildup by China as a threat. China is unlikely to move on things like Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, or Taiwan. And the US, as a result of that, has loosened its approach, perhaps losing what it's called strategic ambiguity towards China, as China in turn loosens its approach to its one country, two systems. And then there's technology. US security services and the Commerce Department are warning about commercial links with China, and there are sanctions against Chinese tech companies and US companies working with Chinese businesses in certain sensitive areas. Against that backdrop, President Xi and President Biden have today said that they want to show responsible world leadership on behalf of the US, and President Xi saying we want to respect each other, coexist in peace, and have a win-win cooperation. There's lots of ambiguity in what those two sets of statements mean. So we're in a very interesting context in which regional trade is either being weaponized or it's being used as it will become a victim of this greater geopolitical power play. So with me to discuss all of this, we have, as I said, Kristy and Henry. And maybe Kristy, I'll ask you first. Do you agree with what I've just said? What are the major shifts in your view in the landscape?
Sure, thanks for that brilliant introduction, Rebecca. I'm a huge fan of numbers, so was writing down some of those numbers that you're attributing to those trade deals. Sure. So I agree with a lot of what you said. Just really briefly, in case people don't know who CBI are, we're the Confederation of British Industry, so the UK's most influential business organisation, speaking on behalf of 190,000 members from various sectors that represent the economy, from farming to finance. So just to give a bit of that context, that's usually where I'll be coming from. So yeah, I would agree. I think there have been some key kind of shifts in the past 10 to 15 years. You know, China and India really as kind of two key individual players in the region. Though, as you've noted, the region as a whole, you know, has increased in importance globally as kind of economies have developed. We've seen a significant increase in consumer demand, consumer wealth, which has really driven a different dynamic in the region. We've also seen kind of India's retrenchment back on itself. That's kind of allowed space for others, I think, as well. And as you noted, you know, the US has really been retreating from the region economically, I would say, since kind of the mid-2010s, if you will, with kind of then Trump's actions taking the US out of TPP at the time, only kind of accelerating that retreat. And you know, China very quickly seized the opportunity around US's non-appearance, and kind of I would say its kind of calculus has always been to exert its economic might in order to kind of secure its position. There have been some, most recently in terms of the UK, because that's kind of where you know, our business representation is, though we are across the globe. And the UK has really upped its presence, I would say, in Southeast Asia with an ASEAN mission established in Jakarta. They achieved ASEAN dialogue partner status, first, I believe, in 25 years, earlier this year, and then, you know, applying to join Cptpp, which is really, I would say, the biggest kind of prize for the UK in terms of trade policy at the moment. So, you know, I would say those have all kind of been significant shifts. I think time will tell a bit, kind of looking to the future. You know, the region is a huge market opportunity for business, for UK business. So, you know, in terms of shifts, just looking at the past and then kind of looking to the future, I think from our perspective, you know, it would be good to kind of see the UK government take a bit more of a strategic approach to its relations with China, and kind of forging that right relationship is key. But yeah, I would say I agree with most of what you said. I think it's a really, really interesting time geopolitically, but I'm happy to have any follow-up, but I think that's it from me for the moment.
I guess what I would ask around that is I think it's around this shifting landscape. You've pointed out that there's a lot of economic power that has gone to the region, and in a way, that's where trade becomes important as a kind of, well, as I said, either as a weaponized tool or as a victim of what's going on geopolitically. So, I mean, what are your members saying about the pivot to Indo-Pacific for companies coming into the region from outside? Has it become more difficult to trade there? Is it something you're noticing?
Sure. So, I mean, I think the number one thing that's come up recently with our members is really kind of logistics and supply chain. So I would really point to that, and kind of it's a bit more of a while longer term kind of resilience in those supply chains is key. I think there's kind of the short term aspect of it as well, to in terms of kind of post COVID, getting things more stable in the region in that perspective. So our members have really been quite clear that that's dominating their thoughts at the moment. But in terms of, Rsep and Cptpp, there's huge member support for progressing with the UK's ascension to Cptpp. I think from a member perspective, there is a balance of kind of the risk and the opportunity in terms of doing business in the region. But, I think for the most part, I would say that our member community has been quite clear that it's a region of significant importance for their kind of business growth.
It's to me, I think that's the most important thing, and it's where, in a sense, there's this kind of conflict. If you look at open strategic autonomy in Europe, what that basically means, if we cut through and translate what that means, it means that Europe is not happy with taking its lead entirely from America, because it doesn't want to sever its relationships with China. The UK has the same conflict because China is so important as a trading partner. Henry, are these shifts in the landscape something you're seeing from within the region?
Yes, definitely. I mean, the way I see it, I think the biggest shift is the economic rise of China, especially since 2008. The rest of the world had a big financial crisis, while China has been on relative ascent, while the rest of the world is on relative decline since then. So you see that all these trade policy developments in the region, basically over the past 15 years or so, are all in some way, respond to the economic rise of China. You see that the U.S. started to negotiate the TPP, back in 2010, trying to a response to China's economic rise, where President Obama said, we want to make sure that it's us rather than China, which will be writing the rules for the future of trade. And then you see the TPP also included interesting provisions like the yuan forwarding rule, which basically try to cut off China from the supply chain that it has built around the region, which it makes it very difficult for us like Vietnam, for example, to source their fabric from China because of this yuan forwarding rule. And then you see China respond to some extent, to the TPP by trying to rebuild its own supply chain, with the RCEP negotiations, which was launched 2 years after the US joining the TPP. And you see that they were able to achieve that kind of more liberal, basic rules of origin and accumulation rules, for example, in the RCEP. And now China also applying to join the Cptpp. So I would say that, basically in this region, everything revolves around China. And that is especially the case in terms of trade policy. And we are going to see this, I would say, for the next 10, 20 years, since would basically continue along the same trajectory.
So it just a question on that. I mean, to what extent has the US actually given China that power by not getting involved with Cptpp?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, and I mean I agree with your assessment in your introductory remarks, where you were kind of disappointed with the new U.S. Administration because they haven't really done much so far in terms of the trade policy. I personally think that the biggest move that the U.S. could make in this region is by announcing that it will be joining the CPTPP. But as we can see from recent statements by the senior officials in the administration, that's probably not going to happen, and that is really a kind of a lost opportunity for the U.S. because. Unless the U.S. Is involved in the region in some meaningful way, especially by joining all these mega FTAs, I do not think that the U.S. would really in terms of setting the rules for international trade, especially in this region. Of course, the U.S. is seeing that they are starting the DIPA, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. They might want to join that. But DIPA only applies to digital trade issues. It doesn't address many of the other issues, such as SOEs, such as competition, such as all these trade remedies rules and market opening and so on. So that is less than sufficient. And I really hope that the U.S. could consider doing more in this region.
So just a question that's come in from the audience actually for you, which is around whether or not China will actually comply with any of these rules if it becomes a member of CPTPP. I guess the first question from me, though, would be, will China be admitted to CPTPP? It's very difficult to say CPTPP first thing in the morning, but anyway, will China actually be admitted, and will it obey the rules if it is admitted?
Well, I think sooner or later China will be admitted. Actually, I wrote an op-ed, about 2 months ago when China first announced that they are applying to join the CPTPP. My take is quite different from what most of the people are saying. I think China will join because, let's be frank, if the US is announcing today that they are going to join the CPTPP, maybe China won't get in. But the US has made it quite clear, I think, to trade observers that they are not going to join the CPTPP anytime soon. Basically, the choice left for the existing CPTPP members is whether you are willing to forego this huge market of China. And many of them are probably going to say no, right, because of very realistic economic reasons. So I don't think it's going to be a big problem for China to accede to the CPTPP, especially because China already has FTAs with most of the CPTPP members, except Canada and Mexico. But can China comply with the rules? Again, I researched on this for a long time, and I understand that the MOFCOM officials have been studying the CPTPP rules very closely, and that is why they are, applying to the CPTPP. In your remarks, for example, you also mentioned that a lot of people link the application with the AUKUS agreement, but I don't think that is the case because as far as I understand it, they have been studying the CPTPP since 2013, since 8 years ago, and they studied every chapter, every provision, and they understand very clear what are the requirements and how they can comply with the requirements. So I don't think this is like off the cuff decision to join the CPTPP. So I would say that they are confident now that they can comply with the requirements under the CPTPP. And I also agree, because if you look at the details of many of the rules under the CPTPP, actually, they do not ask that much from even a country like China. And if you look at what China has committed in many of these latest FTAs, you could see that actually China is almost ready to join the CPTPP.
So a little joke here, or a little aside here. When I was researching one of the books I've written, I discovered that China actually had a game that it played, a sort of almost like Trivial Pursuits on the rules of multilateralism and the World Trade Organization. So it could actually cite all the rules of the World Trade Organization, and it was a game that politicians played. So I think you're probably right that the preparation has been going on for a very long time, but I think we can also credit the Chinese administration with perfect timing in the announcement of when it was going to join. So I'm Kristy, from the point of view of the agreement itself, and China coming into the CPTPP, but equally we've got the Rcep coming into effect on January the 22nd. Do you think that's an opportunity? Do you think it's an opportunity for the region or an opportunity for the outside world?
Sure. Yeah, I think I think both of them are significant opportunities. Rsep, there are key differentiators between Rsep and CPTPP. I think most people appreciate that. Rsep really doesn't kind of address some of the thornier issues of labor, kind of environment, data, state subsidies in any substantive detail. And so I would say it's less kind of economically comprehensive, whereas you have CPTPP, which is far more rigorous, detailed, and could really create, real income gain of 1% of GDP for the CPTPP signatories. And I agree with you. For those that don't appreciate, Rebecca and I are in the UK, so the sun is just coming up. It is CPTPP is always a tongue twister, but this early it certainly is as well. But yeah, so in terms of if China was potentially to join, then that figure kind of on GDP would really only increase. But there are kind of those key differentiators. I don't think from our perspective that it's I think it's positive. I think there's not kind of, in terms of increasing regional tensions, I think really those two trade agreements will really only bring kind of economic incentive to the region and encourage leaders to focus on kind of that post-COVID economic recovery that's really needed. I think it's really noteworthy, particularly from a geopolitical standpoint, that kind of countries such as Australia have signed an agreement with China in terms of despite recent deterioration, I think we can say in kind of commercial and diplomatic relations. So, from a CBI perspective, certainly, I think it just, these types of agreements just bring opportunity for business. I don't think that they'll kind of cause further kind of issues. Trade is really, one of the most powerful forces, I would say, of our time. So we should be looking at it, as a good thing. Just kind of looping back around to some of the, if I may, just on the kind of comments on CPTPP, I do agree with a lot of what Henry was saying. We have the Secretary of Commerce, Raimundo, U.S. Secretary of Commerce in the region, as well as Catherine Tai, the U.S. Trade Representative, and I think they've been fairly clear that they're really on the pursuit of this new economic framework approach, as opposed to looking at joining CPTPP. In terms of kind of China and CPTPP, I think it'd be quite hard for people to ignore kind of the size and influence of China and its market, which really goes to show in terms of the shift that China has done in terms of its economic might, what we might be looking at in the future. But yeah, I would say mostly in terms of agreements on Rsep and CPTPP, a positive for business.
Can I just hold you a little bit on one thing? And again, it's a question that's coming through. It's about China's supply chain. So we have to talk about human rights abuses, and I think it's a very important thing in the context of all these trade agreements, but also in the context of the supply chain review that Biden's administration undertook, published back in June. Now, that has the potential to exclude a lot of very small businesses that are associated with the Xinjiang province and the treatment of the Uyghurs in particular. But it's very, very, very focused on, the whole review is very focused on 5 sectors. The technology review at the moment is also focused on 5 sectors. So is this actually using a different means to exclude China outside of trade agreements? Is it very similar to the Trump approach, or is it actually something materially different? Is this actually genuinely trying to change the way in which we approach those supply chains and restore multilateralism, but by the back door?
Sure, that's an interesting question. I think time will tell a little bit. I mean, when you come to kind of some of the tensions, I think that you've alluded to, you know, China is really a vast kind of multifaceted, fast-changing country, and it poses both opportunities and challenges. I think inevitably both business and policymakers kind of face that tension between kind of commerce and values, not just in China, but in other countries as well. You know, I think we need to remember that business plays a key role there as well, as you've mentioned. I think, you know, from our perspective, responsible companies, you know, uphold global standards in areas for which they're kind of directly responsible, which includes kind of workers' rights and environmental protections. So I think, you know, working to a kind of sets of agreed principles is the approach that that we would kind of press for from a CBI perspective. I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but I think that's kind of the view that we would take when it comes to these types of things.
I mean, the answer is anybody's answer, isn't it? Because I mean, we don't actually know what the motivation was. I mean, we're never going to see that in a legal document. You know, the US has decided it wants to have these policies for strategic reasons, but it does actually point out how strategic trade has become. So, Henry, I mean, just on all of this, I know you don't specifically want to talk about Taiwan as such, but there is a growing political issue there, and I was hosting an event of where two ambassadors were talking, and the tensions that we've got so many strategic alliances, so many trade alliances in the region. They're cross-cutting. The World Trade Organization is a little bit like the League of Nations in the run up to the First World War and Second World War. It's really not a terribly effective organization. So in terms of all of the other deals that are being put together. But the biggest one actually is that, as I said in the introduction, the US has actually loosened its attitude towards Taiwan and said it will defend Taiwan. Is that a tinderbox in the region waiting to be lit?
Well, I don't know how much to be made of this statement. You know, I think you know, when you know, push come to the shove, as they say, I'm not sure that the U.S. would really, you know, do what he said. But just on the trade front, I mean, even though, as you rightly pointed out, I mean, there are all these cross-cutting, you know, agreements in the region. But my review is more positive. I think in some way they could be complementary. You know, I was listening to, you know, what Kristy just said earlier. You know, the collaboration between the Rcep and the Cptpp. You know, even though I agree with most people that the Cptpp is in many ways of a higher standard. You know, the US call it 21st century high standard trade agreements. But I think in some ways, you know, the Rcep can also be said to be a high standard. Let's look, for example, you know, the rules of origin, which is a crucial issue for FTAs. You know, if you look at the regional value content, which is basically the threshold you use to determine whether something is produced from within the RTA, the Cptpp, if I remember correctly, has RAC as high as 55%, and that is very hard for firms to meet. While the Rcep could be as low as 40%, you know, and Rcep also has de minimis rules which allow you to use up to 10% of a value that is not from within the region to count as something that is from the region. So that could further 30% if you do the math. So I would say that, for example, when it comes to rules of origin, the Rcep actually is much more liberal, much higher standard compared to the Cptpp. So actually the firms would benefit more across the region. So I think, you know, when we talk about all these agreements, you know, whether they are good or bad for business firms, I think it's all a matter, you know. It's not that, you know, you have a higher standard that would definitely be better for everyone, you know, like the question you asked regarding labor standards, I think not just China, many countries in the region actually would have difficulty meeting high labor standards, simply because, for example, for child labor, that is another hot issue. For many children in the region, the choices between them, working in the factory versus going to school, the choices between them working in the factory or be starved to death, So, I mean, these are total different considerations that we really have to look at them, from different perspectives to understand the choices that different countries make. I mean, I'm not saying that a specific position is definitely better, but I'm saying that we should be more open-minded and understand that, what are the trade-offs different countries are facing.
I mean, that's absolutely point well made, because I think this is the big issue. We watch these things happening from outside. We look at supply chain reviews. Ultimately, though, if you listen to COP26 and all the rhetoric that came out of COP26 last week, and then the last couple of weeks around climate change, but then if you look at the broader issues around the S in ESG, the social in ESG, this is something that the region actually has to think about. And intra-regional trade is much lower than extra-regional trade, because the region is an emerging region to a very large extent. Take out Japan and South Korea and China and Australia. Even China is emerging to a large extent as well. But you've got in other countries a much weaker industrial base. So there are huge problems, and the world, if it's going to get to some point where we're able to address some of these ESG issues, and we have to, in the interest of the planet, it has to work together. So do you think it was, two questions here really, was it a bad idea for China to stay away from COP26, number one? And number two, is everybody going to have to come together? So we've seen tighter regulations coming in all the regional trade agreements. Is this something where the region can actually help transition to a more sustainable global economy and more sustainable global trade in every sense of the word? Kristy, what do you think about those?
Sure. So, I think the way you termed it in terms of China staying away from COP, I don't know if I would totally agree. I mean, obviously, Xi Jinping didn't travel, but they certainly had a significant kind of presence at COP, as evidenced by some of the final verbiage that came through in the pact at the last minute, if you will. But I understand kind of the thought process there. I think in terms of the kind of COP question, what was interesting to me and from a geopolitical standpoint was that that COP actually really, to me, reinforced kind of the point that the US has when it wants to, has the room to and potential to really lead and have an impact on the global stage, which we know but probably haven't seen as much, in my opinion, in recent years under, coming up to the end of the Biden administration. So, the Biden and Kerry really carried a lot of weight. At COP, you still had kind of the superstar power of Barack Obama and kind of, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez coming through there. And, after taking the kind of backseat to Trump for 4 years, were really a driving force at Glasgow. So kind of an interesting where in some instances, the US has stepped back and China has kind of filled into that vacuum. Perhaps you could say with COP, maybe there was a little bit of a tilt there in a different direction in one instance. Although, I do think it was significant that there was kind of that shift at the final hour. I didn't quite catch the second question because I started to go a bit off piste with the COP question. But perhaps Henry wants to tackle whatever that might be, or I can come back.
Well, so maybe maybe in the interest of just moving, it was a common question really. It was more around whether or not the US and China need each other. And so Henry, I don't know whether you want to comment on that. I mean, if we're going to meet the sustainability goals, the US and China surely need each other. We need them to work well together. We need to resolve some of these sort of trade issues, don't we?
Well, they certainly need to work with each other, and each country should poise to share. But I think it's important to understand China's perspective in this regard. I mean, for China, first of all, China reviews this issue of a historical justice. Basically, what China is seeing is that you developed countries, you have been polluting, for hundreds of years, and you achieved development in your economy. And now, when we are about to sort of our own economy to catch up with yours, you started to see we are polluting the environment and we should stop. So for China, it's a matter of developmental right. You have developed your economy. Now you can see on the fruits of your development, and we want to go to the same position as you, and you cannot deny us from doing that. And second, I think, to be fair, we have to consider things in broader perspective, and if you put different things together, you can see there's a lot of double standard and hypocrisy involved. To just give you one example, the EU and US has been criticizing China for a long time of polluting the environment by producing, for example, the coal, which is this coke, which is essential in steel making. Basically, if you want to make steel, the fuel that you use in the normal coal, it must be going through the so-called coking process, so that you can use it in the steel furnace. And China is actually the biggest producer of coke. And that is because in most developed countries like the US and EU, they have closed down the coke factories because it's so polluting, But then when China tried to deal with the environmental pollution issues caused by the coking plants, China was trying to close them down, was trying to limit the imports and so on. The US and EU started to criticize China for violating its WTO obligations by saying that, look, you agreed in your accession process not to put export quotas on all these raw materials. And they brought a case in the WTO, and they won the case. And China basically lost on the technical point because its accession protocol did not explicitly mention this Article 20 of the GATT, which basically allows China to invoke environmental measures as a kind of exception, to justify its measures. And I think here, this is an example of a double standard. On the one hand, you are criticizing China, for polluting the environment. On the other hand, to do something to stop the pollution, you are telling them, no, you cannot do that. That would violate your WTO obligations. I think if the West really want to, get China to contribute, they also need to stop a lot of this double standard and make them the actions consistent, rather than just pointing fingers at China and criticizing China. They should allow China, also to take measures for environmental reasons, rather than banning China from doing that by exploiting these really technical, loopholes in China's accession protocol. And if they do that, they would be able to get a lot of goodwill from China and cooperation from China. And if they don't do that, I think it would be naive for them to expect China to follow what they say rather than what they do.
I think the point you're making actually is one around economic diplomacy, and this is obviously the title of the session, because what we're actually seeing is a breakdown in diplomacy. We're seeing a breakdown in the trade diplomacy. You've got just a question coming through about tensions between the US Exim and Sinosure. Well, those tensions have been brewing for some time now. I mean, if you go to a US Exim conference, it's almost like a war cry sometimes. So I mean, we've got this economic diplomacy, which is actually really powerful. The weapon in economic diplomacy, of course, is trade. And so what can we do actually to create that type of landscape where we're positive about trade? To what extent do we actually need all of these fragmented organizations? Do we need Rcep Rsep, and do we need CPTPP, and do we need ASEAN, or do we want the region to work more closely together? Would that be a way of helping China to have the power that it needs in the region? And would it be a way of creating almost like a trading bloc power to counterbalance what's effectively a regulatory power in Europe? Do we need all of these things, and how? And if we don't, then is there something like the World Trade Organization that we need to replace it all with?
I mean, it's a fairly broad question.
Absolutely.
But I think from my perspective, and I had mentioned before, I would probably sit currently on the side of needing them and thinking that they'll drive forward cooperation where perhaps you wouldn't otherwise get it. I kind of see trade as kind of a language that people speak because it's necessary, and they see the direct impact back into their economies. So I think from my perspective, I do think that they're necessary and beneficial and positive, but at the same time, we really are seeing a really shifting landscape. So I also don't want to totally pigeonhole myself and say that those are the only options. I mean, the WTO is a really interesting case. I mean, from our perspective, we're really keen to see, as you might expect, a bigger business voice within the WTO. But the WTO has, functional kind of issues, if you will, that it needs to work through. And we've got kind of MC12, the ministerial conference, coming up in a couple of weeks here, which will be an interesting marker to see if there is shifts on certain things, particularly around the JSIs or kind of on environment and trade. So yeah, I mean, I think the very basic answer to your broad question is that they in our current kind of geopolitical model and they are necessary. Now, what over the next kind of 10 to 20 years are we going to see a shift? And I've kind of mentioned before of this economic framework for the region that the US has kind of mentioned in recently, what that actually looks like, what the implementation of that, who that includes. I think these are all kind of things to keep an eye on. So afraid not a very straightforward answer, but probably the best I can give at the moment.
So we've covered an awful lot of ground in this session, and we have precisely 2.5 minutes left. So I am going to ask each of you just to summarise the key risk and the key opportunity in the region as we look forward into 2022. Henry, do you want to go first? Just a quick summary, key risk, key opportunity.
Well, I would say the key risk is, letting the political tensions derail the economic cooperation and also the trade relationship in the region. I think that is something that everyone have to keep in mind to, prevent the kind of crisis that might emerge because of the political tensions. Well, regarding the opportunities, I would say that this region is the fastest growing region in the whole world, and let's not squander the opportunity. I think the region has a lot more potential for growth, and we should all work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristy.
Yeah, I would say key risk at the moment probably is supply chains and kind of bottleneck of supply chains, and the overall need for a bit more resilience there. So I speak from a business standpoint, so perhaps I would say that. In terms of opportunity for the a bit of a double header for the UK, I think massive opportunity in acceding to CPTPP, and then I also see a really big opportunity for the UK if it can get its kind of strategic approach to how it's going to work with China settled over the next kind of year.
Brilliant. It's my pleasure to thank you both for what's been a really stimulating session. I guess if I was summarising it, it's a work in progress in terms of how we're reconfiguring the global spheres of influence. There's a lot that we can do through economic diplomacy, and trade is a very, very, very important part of all of that. To everyone listening, many thanks. And the next session at GTR Asia is Reflections on the ADB's 2021 Trade Finance Gaps Growth and Jobs Survey led by Stephen Beck from the Asian Development Bank promises to be a really interesting one, looking at access to trade finance, the growing trade finance gap and recovery from the pandemic. Thank you very much for listening.